Hi, I'm Trondson. I just finished research for the University of Wisconsin-Madison for my thesis. I'm also head of school at Woodland Montessori School, and I've taught Montessori for many years. I've been in the field since 1997, and I'm also an adjunct professor at UW River Falls, teaching Montessori to early childhood students. Okay, so my research. I had the privilege of studying at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the title of my thesis was Montessori and Social Justice, the Overlap, the Potential, and the Areas for Growth. Let's see, in all honesty, I started out being really excited about culturally relevant pedagogy and how the Montessori framework really could be used to showcase culturally relevant pedagogy and how those two things might work in tandem. And I did find a lot of that, and I also found some other areas for growth for Montessorians to consider when they're committed to doing this work on social justice. So let me back up and tell you a little bit about my research design. My lit review focused on a couple different bodies of work. These kind of four different categories I really focused on. Education debt being one of them, and it was a phrase that I chose to use more frequently than the achievement gap. It was coined by Gloria Ladson-Billings, one of my professors at the university, and why I used it and why I liked it was because it very much speaks to the fact that this is a generational debt that we're paying. It's not a one-year gap that we can quickly shore up, but it's something that's going to have to be multi-pronged in order to pay back to communities of color, recent immigrant families, and so on. I also read a body of work on culturally relevant pedagogy. There's a big body of work coming out, or that is already in the archives, relating Montessori to this pedagogy. Culturally relevant pedagogy is something that Gloria Ladson-Billings came up with, in how to teachers who work, culturally relevant teachers are teachers who work extremely well with diverse populations, and she lists the characteristics of what that makes in a teacher. And then I also studied the promise of Montessori education and student achievement, and again, the results are mixed there, but also very exciting, especially in the areas of reading and math. And then finally, though, why isn't Montessori moving that needle on student achievement? So that was kind of the background of the work before I kind of dove into my own research. And what I studied was how Montessori educators who work in social justice understand the overlap and the potential of those two frameworks. So someone who is a Montessorian, who's also committed to social justice, how are they seeing those things work together? The method I used was called narrative inquiry. Narrative inquiry is a qualitative method, which I was relieved to find, not being a quantitative and statistics academic. And I interviewed Montessori educators all over the country who identified as being people who worked in social justice. And I really tried to pick their brain using kind of open-ended interview questions on how they saw these things overlap. And the data was amazing. So there were all sorts of examples of classroom practices internally in the classroom that were happening that had to do with Montessori and social justice, and also external examples that had to do with like starting up new schools or analyzing an admissions practice. So I just briefly run through these. I knew I was going to find this. This is what I was really excited to set out to do, and this was the area that I was a little more surprised at, but also became very important to me as a Montessorian as I went through. But the overlapping potential, Montessori classrooms, I found so throughout my data, and I did a open coding kind of strategy to find themes and nested sub-themes. And I found so many examples of culturally relevant teaching happening in Montessori classrooms. Now, the educators might not call it culturally relevant teaching, but that's what they're doing. They're using the students' reference points and culture to ignite learning. I also found how Montessori teaches reading and self-regulation to be really important and seen as a social justice act almost, in that that's something that these students carry with them. Also community building, and that there's a growing population of Montessori educators who are committed to social justice work. As far as areas for growth, I did find a lot of ways in which Montessori kind of needs to unpack its relationship to bias and to privilege in order to really be committed to doing this work. So for example, working to create more welcoming environments. Bias may be inherent in some Montessori cultures. So my participants, the research participants, would talk about examples like how we are affirming dominant culture often in Montessori schools, especially in some of the private settings. If you just look at the car line, for example, or what's coming out in student lunches as ways of affirming dominant culture. Also that Montessori could benefit from emphasizing the inclusive components of the philosophy. So this came up, I educated 2/3 of my research participants were Montessori educators of color, and they spoke again and again where they were often the only African American teacher in their Montessori school, but yet they would go and work within their African American community and talk about how nobody in their communities understood what Montessori was about. And it often had this mixed messages about what it was and how that it wasn't for their child. So the suggestion is that Montessori work on kind of repackaging itself to emphasize these things, that it is an empowering philosophy and advocates for self-discipline and self-regulation and so on and so forth. The debate about fidelity came up again and again, and the suggestion here is to take what we're highlighting in that conversation about fidelity, and what I mean by that is when we talk about who's more Montessori and whose practices are more like Maria Montessori had demonstrated 100 years ago, and open that up to include not only the lessons and the materials, but also all of her writings about approach and about preparation of the teacher, because she wrote a lot about how to meet children where they were at, and I would like to see, when you're talking about who's most Montessori, that be who's best at meeting the child where they're at, and not who's best at giving a lesson like Maria showed us 100 years ago. And then finally, throughout all of the transcripts, I heard again and again the need for a supplemental training or endorsements or whatnot with their Montessori training. Montessori training centers prepared Montessori teachers to an extent, but teachers that were working with non-affluent populations struggled and were calling, almost crying out for additional training in such things like parent engagement, navigating testing, trauma training, mental health support, and anti-bias training. So implications for education, contradictory, but I think they both exist. Montessori needs to be considered as a strategy for inclusivity in the global educational landscape. So it needs to be invited in as a possible solution for equity and diversity issues. And Montessori needs to continue to reflect upon their current practices in order to better serve poor and minority students and actively promote inclusivity. Thank you. Sorry,
Terrific.